My daughter got $100 million and kicked me out of the house. 3 days later, she begged me for help, and I said, imagine losing everything. Your home, your memories, your dignity, all because someone you raised and loved, decides you're no longer needed. That's what happened to me. My daughter, the person I always thought would take care of me, kicked me out of my own house and took it all. An unimaginable amount. $100 million. In the blink of an eye, my life was turned upside down. But what happened next was even more shocking. 3 days after the greatest betrayal of my life, the one person who should have been sorry and asking for forgiveness was, in fact, asking for my help. And it was at that moment that I made the decision that would change everything. Robert's death was an unexpected blow, and its weight hit like a sudden fall. Margaret still couldn't accept it. The man she had spent 43 years with, sharing laughter, tears, and the building of a life together, was now gone. The house they had built together with so much care was empty, just like her heart. Robert, who had always been the pillar of the family, the man who held her hand in the toughest nights, was no longer there. She still found herself waiting to hear his voice, missing his presence. But the reality was different. He was no longer there, and the emptiness he left felt overwhelming. In the first days after his death, Margaret tried to deal with her grief. There was no room for doubts or sadness, only the routine that needed to be maintained. She woke up early, made her coffee, looked out the window, and wondered if she would ever fill the void Robert left. She couldn't believe life could go on without him. The house felt quieter, and it was as if the echo of the laughter, the Sunday dinners, and the birthdays celebrated there had dissipated. It was in that silence that her daughter Victoria's words started to sound louder. Victoria, who had always been Robert's favorite, seemed to now have a sudden concern, an interest that Margaret initially thought was noble. Her daughter had always been polite, but what once seemed like affection now had a different tone. "You can't keep this house on your own, Mom. It's too big for you," Victoria would say softly, but with an insistence Margaret couldn't ignore. It was as if she was starting to distance herself, seeing her mother as a burden, an obligation to be discarded. "Victoria, the house is mine too. It has always been ours," Margaret tried to argue, but her words came out weak, lacking the same conviction they once had. Robert's presence was missing, and she felt the emotional distance from her daughter more than ever. Victoria continued to show concern for her mother, but in a way that seemed more calculated with each passing day. In the first days after Robert's death, Victoria visited often, always with an excuse to suggest that Margaret should leave the house. "You should think about somewhere more suitable, Mom, something more comfortable for you, with people your age. Kevin and I thought it would be good for you." Victoria's words, though sounding concerned, carried a tone Margaret couldn't ignore. It felt like, in every suggestion, there was also the desire to be rid of an inconvenient responsibility. Kevin, Victoria's husband, seemed to be the ideal partner for this transition. He would quietly show up, wearing that cold, professional smile, as if it were all a matter of convenience, logistics. "You'll like a quieter place, Margaret," he said. "You won't have to worry about the house, the costs. It'll be better this way." His words, though intended to sound friendly, only made Margaret feel smaller. Margaret didn't want to believe what was happening. She didn't want to believe that her daughter, the woman she had raised with so much love, was so willing to see her leave. But as the days went by, Margaret began to realize that her daughter and son-in-law had other plans. The house she and Robert had cared for so long was being treated like a commodity, something to be sold or redistributed. It was the first time she saw the love she thought was present in her family being torn apart like this. The last straw came on a Tuesday morning. Victoria arrived with Kevin, a forced smile on her face, carrying 2 large suitcases. "Mom, we've made a decision," Victoria said calmly, the tone Margaret was beginning to hate. "Kevin got a big promotion at work, and we need to move to the city. This place here is perfect for us, so we'll need you to find somewhere else to live." Victoria's words were like a sharp blade cutting through her soul. "But this house is mine." "Robert's and mine," Margaret tried to contest, but her voice trembled, and the strength she once had seemed to crumble before her. "Actually, Mom," Victoria said, her voice turning more cruel with each word, "according to Dad's will, the house and everything he left are mine. I've been letting you stay here for a while, but it's time for you to find somewhere else." The shock was immediate. The pain of loss was quickly replaced by the pain of betrayal. Victoria's words echoed in Margaret's mind like thunder, and everything she knew was falling apart. Margaret didn't know what to do. What does one do when their own daughter treats them like a burden, like something to get rid of? How do you react when the person you trusted most, the one you raised, turns her back on you so coldly? She felt the world spin, and the cruel reality started to set in. Kevin, with his characteristic coldness, began to help load Margaret's bags into the car. His expression was that of someone simply doing a task, an impersonal, emotionless task. "It'll be good for you, Margaret," he said, like he was doing her a favor. "You'll be more independent now. You won't have to worry about the house." Margaret watched, speechless, as the house she and Robert had built, that had sheltered their family for so many decades, faded before her eyes. It was as if she was being discarded, as if all her memories, love, and hopes had been stolen. What she feared most had become reality: abandonment by her own daughter, the loss of her house, and her dignity. But as the car pulled away, Margaret couldn't shake the strange feeling that began to grow inside her. Anger, yes, but also determination. She knew she couldn't just accept this. Something needed to be done. She didn't know what yet, but a spark of strength was beginning to ignite in her chest. That night was long. Margaret couldn't sleep. The loneliness felt more present than ever, and the pain of betrayal seemed to bother her more than the loss of Robert. She felt as if her own daughter had ripped away what was left of her dignity, the only thing she still believed she had after her husband's death. The anger grew, mixed with confusion. How could Victoria do this? How could she betray her own mother after everything Margaret had done for her? But amidst the pain, something began to change inside her. The sense of helplessness was replaced by a silent determination. She wouldn't be a victim anymore. The house was empty, but not in a sad way. The emptiness of 847 Oakwood Drive now seemed filled with a different kind of energy. Margaret felt the need to take action, to do something before she lost herself further in the spiral of suffering and despair. She didn't know what to do yet, but one thing was clear. She couldn't allow Victoria and Kevin to destroy her life with the coldness with which they were trying to. In the early hours of the morning, Margaret rose from bed and made her way to Robert's study. She knew he was organized, perhaps even obsessively so. The house was silent, but her steps felt more firm, more decisive. As she entered the study, she sat at the desk where he had spent hours working, adjusting business deals, making decisions, always calculating each step. She looked at the chair where Robert used to sit and felt a sharp pain in her chest, but at the same time, a desire to move forward, to take action, began to stir inside her. It was there, among papers and documents that appeared to have been carefully arranged, that Margaret found the key to her revolution: the will. She had seen it years ago when Robert made it, but what she remembered was what he had told her. Everything was clear. Everything was laid out justly, according to what they had built together. However, that was before he died. Now, with his death, Victoria was trying to steal everything, using a will that had likely been manipulated to benefit her in a cruel way. With trembling hands, Margaret searched through the papers. She knew that if something was wrong, this was where she would find the answers. The original will was there, intact, and soon she found what she feared. Victoria had not only taken the house and the assets, but she was also trying to control the inheritance narrative, hiding crucial details. The false version of the will she claimed was valid was nothing but a fraud. Margaret's heart raced. She felt a mix of surprise, but also a sense of power beginning to grow inside her. She had been deceived by Victoria, but no more. Robert, although no longer present, had made sure to protect his wife from such a betrayal. He had foreseen this. The real will included a crucial clause. If Victoria Sullivan Hayes fails to treat her mother with respect and dignity after my death, the entirety of my estate will pass to her. But if she does not, the majority will go to my wife, Margaret, and a smaller yet considerable portion will go to my daughter, contingent on her respect at all times. Margaret felt a wave of relief mixed with fury. Robert knew what Victoria would do. He had been protected, and so had she. The game was now in her hands. She could no longer allow herself to be the victim, the woman who would swallow humiliation after humiliation. She was in a position of strength, and she knew she had to act. That afternoon, Margaret picked up the phone and called Robert's trusted lawyer, Harrison Fitzgerald. He knew her well, and knew how capable she was of handling tough situations, but something in her voice was different today. She was no longer speaking as the grieving widow who had lost her husband, but as the woman preparing to fight for everything she was owed. "Harrison," said Margaret, her voice steady but filled with purpose, "I have the will. I was deceived by Victoria, and now I know that what she's showing is a fake version. Robert made provisions for this. He knew what would happen. We need to act fast. I can't wait any longer." Harrison was quick to respond. "Margaret, I'm so glad you called. Robert always had great confidence in you. When he asked me to prepare the will, he was clear about his intentions. I know this situation with your daughter must be difficult, but I need you to bring me the documents so we can settle this properly." Margaret was resolute. "Harrison, I have everything here. Victoria took control of the house and the money. She's trying to get away with it, but I'm not going to let her. We need to take this head on. It's time to end this charade." The call ended, and Margaret felt empowered, like she was taking control of her life once again. She knew what she had to do, and she wouldn't let her daughter and son-in-law get away with stealing everything that belonged to her. This wasn't just about money, it was about justice. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. As Margaret sat back in Robert's chair, she realized how far she had come in such a short time. The woman who had been sitting in the guest room just days ago feeling abandoned and discarded, was now plotting her next move. No longer a widow consumed by grief, she was a woman determined to rewrite the story, a woman who would stand tall and fight for herself. The sun rose slowly on the horizon as Margaret woke that morning. The house was quiet, still, but unlike the past days, the atmosphere was one of control. She had made a decision. She would no longer submit to the manipulation of her daughter and son-in-law. She would not allow them to push her out of her own life. She was in a war now, and she was ready to fight. Margaret dressed quickly and without hesitation, grabbed the papers from Robert's will that she had found in his study. She felt firmer with each step she took. The weight of the will in her hands was more than just a piece of paper. It was the key to her freedom and to the justice she knew she deserved. She picked up the phone and called Harrison Fitzgerald, Robert's trusted lawyer. "Margaret, good to hear from you with renewed spirit," Harrison said when he answered the phone. He knew that she was dealing with more than just the loss of Robert. The situation with Victoria was tense, and he knew she needed to act quickly. "Harrison, I need your help to expose Victoria's fraud. She is using a fake version of Robert's will, and I need this resolved as soon as possible," Margaret said, firmly in her voice. "I understand. Do you have the documents with you? It's crucial that everything is verified before we take any legal action against your daughter," Harrison replied, with the calm of someone who had dealt with many battles, but with a tone of urgency Margaret couldn't ignore. "Yes, I have them, and I need your help to make sure everything is done correctly, so she can't manipulate the situation any further. I want this resolved quickly," Margaret insisted. Harrison paused before responding, knowing that what was coming wouldn't be simple. "Margaret, prepare yourself. If what you're saying is true, and if Victoria is indeed manipulating the will, this won't be a straightforward matter, but I'll stand by you every step of the way. We will get this done." The call ended, and for a moment, Margaret sat there, still, looking at the documents in her hands. She knew she was about to enter a battle with her own daughter, someone she had raised and loved unconditionally. The pain of the betrayal, though deep, was nothing compared to the need for justice. She had to protect what was hers, the house, Robert's memory, and more than anything, her dignity. Hours later, Margaret found herself in Harrison's office. The space was formal and silent, with bookshelves stacked high with legal volumes and a large oak desk in the center. Harrison greeted her with a nod and led her to the chair across from him. "Margaret, what you've brought are substantial pieces of evidence," Harrison said, eyeing the documents carefully. "This will has been altered. I have no doubt that the version Victoria presented to you is a forgery." Margaret felt the weight of his words, but also a sense of relief. She was no longer alone. Harrison was on her side, and that made her feel like she could finally fight. "So, what do we do now?" Margaret asked, her tone now more confident, a new strength emanating from her. "I want Victoria to know that she can't manipulate everything to her advantage. I want her to face the consequences." Harrison looked at her, impressed by her determination. "First, let's ensure the original will is validated. Then, we should file a formal action against her for fraud. That will make her understand that the game is over." The plan was set in motion, but Margaret knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. She wasn't just fighting for money or property. She was fighting for her right to be respected, to be treated with dignity. And above all, she was fighting to show her daughter that despite the pain, she still had power that Victoria couldn't destroy. As the legal process moved forward, Victoria and Kevin were busy trying to maintain control of the situation. They had no idea that Margaret had the original documents in her possession, nor did they think she would act with such resolve. They believed the grieving widow, the one who suffered from the loss, was no threat to them. It wasn't until weeks later that Harrison called again, and things started to intensify. "Margaret," he said, his voice heavy with gravity, "we have good news. The forgery has been confirmed, and Victoria is now under investigation. But there's more. We've discovered that she tried to alter the will again, possibly with help from someone on Kevin's side." The revelation hit Margaret like a blow. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She knew that Kevin and Victoria were manipulators, but now it was clear that the betrayal ran even deeper. They had tried again to hide the truth, but Margaret wouldn't let them. She couldn't. "They think I'm just going to stand by and let them do this," Margaret thought. "Now it's my turn to turn the tables." Margaret wasn't someone who backed down. She had spent years supporting Robert, managing their home, their finances, and even the family business when he couldn't. And now, she was finally ready to reclaim what was hers. Harrison's news was only the first step in what would become a lengthy legal battle, but Margaret was prepared. The more she learned about Victoria's attempts to manipulate the will, the more determined she became. Victoria had underestimated her mother. She had thought that Margaret, the quiet housewife, would simply accept the cruelty and disappear into the background. But Margaret had never been the woman she seemed. She had fought for Robert, for their family, and now she would fight for herself. Weeks went by as the investigation unfolded. Harrison worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing the case. Margaret, for her part, took action in ways she hadn't imagined she was capable of. She began reaching out to people who knew Victoria and Kevin, talking to friends, neighbors, and even Robert's business partners. She wasn't just going to let Victoria take everything from her. She was going to expose her for the fraud she was. One afternoon, as Margaret sat in the living room, staring at the house she had once shared with Robert, she felt a deep sense of resolve. She had loved this house. Every creak in the floorboards, every scratch on the walls, every corner that held a memory. It had been a place of love and family, but it was also a place of strength. Robert had built it, and together they had filled it with life. It was her home, and it would remain that way. Then, just as she was beginning to formulate her next move, the phone rang. Harrison's voice was calm, but urgent. "Margaret, I think it's time we confront Victoria directly. We've got the evidence we need, and now it's time to let her know that we're not backing down." Margaret felt her heart race. Confronting Victoria wasn't something she was looking forward to, but it was necessary. "Let's do it," she said, her voice steady. "It's time to show her who she's messing with." Margaret woke up that morning with a strange feeling. It was as if the weight of the previous week had dissipated, leaving an unusual lightness in her chest. The day was clear, but her mind was clouded by a persistent thought. They think they've won. Victoria and Kevin's betrayal had been hard, but now, with the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Margaret felt that control was back in her hands. She had the documents she needed, and with Harrison's help, she knew that the coming weeks would be decisive. As she drank her coffee, a thought struck her. What would Robert have done in my position? He had always been calculating, meticulous, never letting anything slip through his control. Even in his final days, it seemed like he had anticipated Victoria's moves. Margaret smiled, thinking about how well he knew his daughter. The lie she was trying to sell was about to fall apart. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Harrison. "Margaret, we have a major update," he said, his voice tense. "I've double-checked the will, and I can't say for sure yet, but there's something off. Robert's signature looks out of place. I need you to bring me the original papers. This fraud might be deeper than we thought." Margaret felt her stomach drop. The original will had been right there in front of her, as perfect as Robert had always been in his decisions. But now she knew that something else was at play. "Harrison, what do you mean by out of place?" He paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "It means that Victoria may have tried to modify the will before Robert passed away. If that's true, the fraud is much bigger than we thought." Margaret knew the truth was more complicated than it seemed. A chill ran down her spine. "I'll bring the documents immediately." When she arrived at Harrison's office, the tension in the room was palpable. The lawyer was reviewing the papers, examining them as if his life depended on it. He looked up at Margaret and gestured silently for her to sit. "Margaret, what you've brought here are substantial pieces of evidence," Harrison said, eyeing the documents carefully. "This will has been altered. I have no doubt that the version Victoria presented to you is a forgery." Margaret felt the weight of his words, but also a sense of relief. She was no longer alone. Harrison was on her side, and that made her feel like she could finally fight. "So, what do we do now?" Margaret asked, her tone now more confident, a new strength emanating from her. "I want Victoria to know that she can't manipulate everything to her advantage. I want her to face the consequences." Harrison looked at her, impressed by her determination. "First, let's ensure the original will is validated. Then, we should file a formal action against her for fraud. That will make her understand that the game is over." The plan was set in motion, but Margaret knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. She wasn't just fighting for money or property. She was fighting for her right to be respected, to be treated with dignity. And above all, she was fighting to show her daughter that, despite the pain, she still had power that Victoria couldn't destroy. As the legal process moved forward, Victoria and Kevin were busy trying to maintain control of the situation. They had no idea that Margaret had the original documents in her possession, nor did they think she would act with such resolve. They believed the grieving widow, the one who suffered from the loss, was no threat to them. It wasn't until weeks later that Harrison called again, and things started to intensify. "Margaret," he said, his voice heavy with gravity, "we have good news. The forgery has been confirmed, and Victoria is now under investigation. But there's more. We've discovered that she tried to alter the will again, possibly with help from someone on Kevin's side." The revelation hit Margaret like a blow. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She knew that Kevin and Victoria were manipulators, but now it was clear that the betrayal ran even deeper. They had tried again to hide the truth, but Margaret wouldn't let them. She couldn't. "They think I'm just going to stand by and let them do this," Margaret thought. "Now it's my turn to turn the tables." In the following days, Margaret began gathering everything she could on Victoria and Kevin. She spoke to old acquaintances of Robert's and sifted through his personal files. Every document, every receipt, seemed to fit perfectly into a puzzle she was starting to see in her mind. One afternoon, during a meeting with Harrison, he brought her a new revelation. "Margaret, we found something interesting. Kevin has a direct connection to a lawyer in Chicago known for manipulating wills. I wouldn't call that a coincidence. The air became heavy, and Margaret felt a surge of adrenaline course through her veins. They had underestimated her ability to find the right pieces to destroy the lies they had built. As she prepared for the confrontation, she looked around her house, now empty, but filled with memories. This was where Robert had sacrificed so much for so long, and now she felt as if she were his last defense against the daughter he had created. The room was about to become the stage for a battle that, she knew, would change everything, and the tension was only rising. Margaret felt as if she were in a chess game, every move now being calculated with precision. The battle she was fighting against her own daughter and son-in-law was not just legal, but emotional. They had tried to manipulate her, humiliate her, but what they didn't know was that Robert, even in his final days, had prepared the battlefield so she could take control at the right moment. And that moment, for Margaret, had arrived. The process was moving faster than she expected. With the confirmation of the will's forgery, Victoria and Kevin were now under investigation. Every step they took seemed like another attempt to evade the truth, but truth always finds a way. And now, Margaret was determined to make them face it. The following morning, Harrison called with a piece of news that accelerated Margaret's heartbeat. "Margaret, the case is taking a new direction. We've gathered enough evidence, and now we can take action. We'll confront Victoria and Kevin directly, and we have the legal backing to do so." Margaret stayed silent for a moment, feeling the gravity of the situation. "It's time then," she replied with renewed firmness. "They thought they could control me, that I would remain silent. Now, we'll make it right." The plan was bold, but Margaret knew there was no more time to hesitate. She wanted Victoria to feel the weight of her choices. She wanted her daughter to understand that she couldn't escape unscathed. And above all, the consequences of her actions would not be just about money, but about morality. It was about the truth, about what Robert had always known, and what Margaret was now going to bring to light. That day, Margaret prepared for the confrontation, not just with Victoria, but with the world she thought she was protecting. She dressed simply, yet with an air of elegance, as she always had. There was something about the outfit that made her feel stronger. She was more than ready for this. When she entered the meeting room, with Harrison by her side, she could feel the tension in the air. Victoria and Kevin were already there, sitting, their faces showing an appearance of calm that only fueled Margaret's anger. They knew they were playing dirty, but still believed they could control everything. That confidence they displayed, however, was fragile, and Margaret was about to destroy it. Victoria looked at her mother with a forced smile. "Mom, I thought we already settled this. I don't see why we need to complicate it further." Margaret wasn't fooled by the calm mask Victoria was trying to project. She knew her daughter was preparing for a psychological game, but Margaret had already played her cards. "You still don't get it, Victoria," she responded, her voice firm and full of authority that her daughter had never recognized. "This was never about money. It was never about the house. It was about respect, about dignity." Kevin, who had remained silent up to that point, looked at Margaret with an impassive expression, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed his unease. They knew they were losing control of the situation, and the fear was something Margaret had never seen in her son-in-law before. "You really think we'll let you take everything, Margaret?" he asked, his voice falsely calm. "You've already lost, Kevin," Margaret said without hesitation. "You and Victoria have nothing left. Not anymore. The house, the assets, all of it is mine by right." That's when Harrison intervened, opening the folder with the documents that detailed the entire fraud. "Here's the proof, Victoria. Here's the proof of everything you and Kevin did. You tried to manipulate the will, forge documents, hide the truth from everyone. This isn't just a mistake, it's a crime." The color drained from Victoria's face. She looked at Kevin, clearly rattled. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is impossible." But the reality was now laid out before them. Harrison had all the evidence needed to ensure that Victoria and Kevin faced the legal consequences of their actions. The forgery, the attempts at manipulation, it was all now under investigation. The humiliation was becoming inevitable. "I'm not the woman you think you can control anymore," Margaret declared, with a coldness that surprised even herself. "And I won't let you destroy what my family built for your own selfishness and greed." Victoria tried to pull herself together, but the words she was searching for were nowhere to be found. The blow had been final, and as much as she tried to manipulate the situation, it was too late. Harrison paused before speaking again, clearly satisfied with how things were unfolding. "Victoria, Kevin, you have until the end of the day to turn yourselves in. The police have already been notified. From now on, there's no way out." Margaret watched, with a look of satisfaction, as the expression on Victoria's face shifted. The daughter she had raised was now before her, vulnerable, exposed, with nothing left to hide. What once seemed like a game of manipulation was now being played by Margaret's rules. In the days that followed the confrontation, the reality of what was happening finally sank in. Victoria and Kevin were now under serious investigation. No longer able to manipulate the system, they were facing the consequences of their actions, and the pain of losing everything they had planned began to overwhelm them. But for Margaret, justice was being done. She hadn't just regained the house and the assets that were hers by right, but she was also rebuilding her own life. The days of suffering were behind her, and she felt stronger than ever. As she walked through the house, now filled with her presence once again, a smile unconsciously appeared on her face. She had gained more than just a legal victory. She had reclaimed herself, and she knew that, with her strength and determination, there was nothing that could stop her future. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal and personal events for Margaret. The investigations into Victoria and Kevin progressed quickly, with both formally charged with fraud and conspiracy. What had once seemed like an impossible battle was now becoming a clear victory, and Margaret was beginning to realize that the pain of betrayal was finally starting to dissipate. Margaret spent her days in silence, reflecting on the past few months of her life. When all of this began, she had been lost, a woman with a broken heart from the death of Robert and the ruthless actions of her daughter. But now, she found herself standing tall, stronger, and more certain of herself than she ever imagined possible. The house at 847 Oakwood Drive, once the stage of pain and loss, was now becoming a place of recovery and rebirth. Margaret had decided that no one would take it from her. She was the owner of the house, not just legally, but emotionally as well. Each room, every space within it, reminded her of Robert, but also of her own strength. Over the course of these weeks, she reconnected with old friends and family members who had, until then, been distant. Robert had always protected her, and she had never needed to seek outside support. But now, she knew her life could not be lived alone. She began to open her heart again, trusting more in the people around her. And with that, a new Margaret began to emerge, calmer, more balanced, and above all, freer. I always thought I needed someone to complete me, Margaret thought as she looked out the window, watching the sunset. But what I really needed was to find the strength within myself. I don't need anyone to give me value. I am complete as I am. She allowed herself finally to feel gratitude for everything she had learned along the way. What had seemed like a devastating humiliation had transformed into a learning and growth experience. Margaret now understood that it wasn't what happened to her that mattered, but what she did with what happened. She had taken control of her own life, and from now on, nothing could take her off that path. Harrison's visit, the lawyer who had stood by her throughout the process, was one of the turning points. He found her in the garden, sitting with a cup of tea, looking at the flowers that were beginning to bloom again. "Margaret," Harrison began, with a sincere smile on his face, "you are an extraordinary woman. I don't know how many people would have had the courage to face what you faced and come out of it stronger. Now, with the case resolved, you can finally rest. Victoria and Kevin will pay for their crimes, and you can move on." She smiled, but her gaze was distant, as though she were in a much deeper place in her mind. "I don't want to look back, Harrison. I've been through it all. Now I want to look forward and start over." "You deserve it, Margaret," he said, with a tone of genuine respect. "You found strength where I doubted it was possible, and now your life will be yours again." Harrison left with a friendly hug, and Margaret stood there, looking at the house that was slowly beginning to hold a new meaning. She felt a deep peace that she never imagined she would find. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but now she felt ready for anything. In the days that followed, Margaret began to explore new interests, things she had always wanted to do but never had time for. She started painting, something that calmed her and connected her to her own essence. Art, which had always been around her, now helped her express the freedom she had finally found within herself. She also grew closer to her local community, participating in events and supporting causes she believed in. Margaret realized that her strength wasn't just in her ability to fight, but also in her ability to love and connect with others. She was creating a new version of herself, one that was no longer defined by the mistakes and betrayals of others, but by her own ability to reinvent herself. The letters from Victoria and Kevin arrived with a settlement proposal. They were trying to avoid a more severe sentence. However, Margaret ignored them. She no longer wanted to be involved with them, not even to finalize the details. They had what they deserved, and she no longer needed to think about them. What really mattered now was what she would do with her life from here on. The wind was soft that late afternoon, and Margaret looked at the house at 847 Oakwood Drive with a sense of serenity. So many things had changed. Both the space and herself had transformed over the past months. What had once been a stage for pain and betrayal was now becoming a symbol of her renewed strength, her ability to move forward, and to find a new meaning in everything she had lived. She walked through each room of the house, touching the walls, the furniture, feeling the history and memories of her family. But this time, There was no pain, only gratitude. She knew she had overcome something much greater than she had ever imagined. The weight of vengeance had been replaced by the lightness of resolution. She no longer needed to fight. The battle was won. Margaret now had a new beginning ahead of her. With the justice done, she could finally focus on the future. Victoria and Kevin had faced the consequences of their actions, and the final settlement had been made. They would pay for what they had done, but she knew that nothing would bring back the lost time, nor the respect she had once had for them. What mattered now was what she would build from this point forward. The phone rang again, interrupting her thoughts. It was Harrison. "Margaret, the case has finally been concluded. The court has approved the settlement. Victoria and Kevin have received their sentences, and now you're free to move on. I just wanted to congratulate you for everything you've accomplished. I knew you had the strength to succeed." She smiled as she heard Harrison's words. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. "Thank you, Harrison. I couldn't have gotten this far without your help. But more importantly, I've learned to fight for myself, and that is priceless." The lawyer paused, and his voice softened. "You're an extraordinary woman, Margaret. Never underestimate the power of your determination." Margaret stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on Harrison's words. "I know that now," she replied, with a peaceful smile. "Now, I can finally leave everything behind and look to the future." She hung up the phone and sat in the living room, watching the soft light coming through the windows. She had faced her fears, her traumas, and above all, the pain inside. And through this journey, she had rebuilt herself in ways she never thought possible. Her journey hadn't been easy. The suffering and betrayals she had endured made her stronger, but they also made her wiser. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that what truly mattered wasn't the things she owned, but how she saw herself and how she allowed herself to be. The love she had always given her family now had to be turned toward herself. Margaret stood up and walked to the garden, feeling the coolness of the air. The flowers were starting to bloom again, just as she was. The pain of Robert's loss and the betrayal of Victoria now seemed distant, a shadow of the past. She had found peace within herself, and she knew that from now on, nothing could stop her. She bent down to touch one of the flowers, the soft fragrance mixing with the breeze. "I am strong. I am worthy," she whispered to herself. And for the first time, she truly believed it. In the following weeks, Margaret began exploring new interests, things she had always wanted to do but never had time for. She started painting, something that calmed her and connected her to her essence. Art, which had always been around her, now helped her express the freedom she had finally found within herself. She also grew closer to her local community, attending events and supporting causes she believed in. Margaret realized that her strength wasn't just in her ability to fight, but also in her ability to love and connect with others. She was creating a new version of herself, one that was no longer defined by the mistakes and betrayals of others, but by her own ability to reinvent herself. The letters from Victoria and Kevin arrived with a settlement proposal. They were trying to avoid a more severe sentence. However, Margaret ignored them. She no longer wanted to be involved with them, not even to finalize the details. They had what they deserved, and she no longer needed to think about them. What really mattered now was what she would do with her life from here on. She started making plans for the future, dreaming of things she had once thought impossible. Traveling, writing a book, experiencing life without the shadows of the past looming over her. Margaret had spent so much of her life caring for others, but now it was time for her to live for herself. The world was waiting, and she was finally ready to embrace it. Margaret, the woman who had once been betrayed and abandoned, was now completely transformed. She had not only regained her house and dignity, but she had also found peace within herself and the freedom to live her life fully. The story of her life was now written by her and not by anyone else. And with this new perspective, she knew that nothing could stop her journey. Whatever came next, she would be ready. Months had passed since the resolution of the case that had dominated Margaret's life. Time, as always, healed the wounds, and she was beginning to realize the truth that, for so long, she had ignored. The power of starting over. The woman she had been before the tragedy, the pain, the betrayal, now seemed almost unrecognizable. She looked back at the woman who once felt fear, insecurity, and devastating loss, and felt deeply grateful for her journey. The house at 847 Oakwood Drive, now completely renovated, symbolized her rebuilding. The garden flourished with exuberance, reflecting her renewed soul. The walls, which had once echoed with the silence of pain and loss, were now full of laughter, soft music, and often even the sound of Margaret painting. She hadn't just restored the house, she had restored her life. Little by little, the doors she had closed to the world began to open again. The pain that had once dominated her was now replaced with the lightness of a new beginning. She began to travel, something she had always dreamed of, but never had the courage to do. She visited new places, new cultures, and, most importantly, got to know herself in a deeper way. She discovered that true freedom didn't come from the absence of obstacles, but from the courage to face and overcome them. She began to write, something she had always wanted to do but had kept to herself. Her journals transformed into a book, telling the story of her journey. It wasn't just a narrative about loss and revenge, but about rediscovering inner strength, resilience, and self-love. Writing set her free. She allowed herself to explore her emotions in a raw and honest way, without fear of judgment, without fear of being vulnerable. Her friends noticed her strength, her serenity, her completeness. Those who had distanced themselves, perhaps because they didn't understand the weight she carried, started to come back. She didn't reprimand them. On the contrary, she welcomed them back with a smile. She understood that pain often separates us from others, but forgiveness and understanding reconnect us. She was no longer a woman marked by betrayal. She was someone who had learned to accept, forgive herself, and love herself first and foremost. Love, she knew, was no longer a desperate search to fill a void. She no longer needed anyone to feel complete. The idea that she would be incomplete without another person had been a lie she had told herself for many years. True love came from within, and with that, she felt more whole than ever. One day, while walking through the garden, she stopped and looked at the flowers that had just bloomed. The wind swayed the leaves of the trees, and she smiled, feeling at peace. She finally understood what Robert had always known, that life is made of moments that can't be controlled, but can be fully lived. He had prepared her for this, even without knowing. She had learned to be strong, not because of the pain, but in spite of it. The pain, which initially seemed like a sentence of death for her soul, had turned into a tool for growth. She had learned to use the scars of the past to shape a brighter future. The phone rang. It was Harrison, her lawyer, but also a friend. He had always supported her, and she knew he was happy for her. They spoke less now, as she no longer needed his guidance, but he still made sure to be present in her life. "Margaret, how are you?" Harrison's voice came through the phone. "I'm good, Harrison. Better than ever," she replied, a smile on her face. "Life now has a new flavor. Not only have I recovered what was mine, but I have recovered myself, and that is priceless." He laughed lightly. "I knew you would make it. I always knew. And it seems you've not only won the battle but also found the peace you deserved." "Yes," she said, looking toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "I've won, not by vengeance but by peace. Now I am the owner of my life, and that is enough for me." They talked for a while, and Margaret realized that, of all the lessons life had taught her, perhaps the most important one was the ability to rise, to reinvent herself, and to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. Life, after all, is never a straight line. It's the twists, the highs and lows, the falls and the rises that make the journey meaningful. That evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky, Margaret sat on the porch of the house and closed her eyes. The soft sound of the breeze through the trees and the aroma of the flowers brought her a sense of calm that she never imagined she would experience. She knew that, despite everything she had lived, what really mattered was the present. And the present, at that moment, was hers. She had taken control of her story. And with that, she was ready to write the next chapters, unafraid of the past ever haunting her again. Margaret, now looking at the horizon with a peaceful heart, thought about how life never prepares us for obstacles, but always gives us the capacity to overcome them. She had known what it was to lose, what it was to be betrayed, what it was to watch her world crumble at her feet. But more importantly, she had known what it was to rise, what it was to turn pain into strength, what it was to reinvent herself in the face of adversity. Sometimes life takes us down paths we don't expect, and we have no control over the moments that challenge us. But at some point, we learn that we are stronger than we ever imagined, and amid the pain, we find our true strength, Margaret thought, feeling a deep calm. The secret isn't in avoiding the falls, but in knowing that we can always rise again, no matter how much pain touches us, or how much life tries to knock us down. What truly matters is what we do with every opportunity given to us. She took a deep breath, letting this truth crystallize in her mind. Because life, after all, is not about what we lose, but about what we gain by persisting, by believing in ourselves, when everything seems lost. As she herself had lived, true power comes from within, from the courage to keep going, to start over, to never give up, no matter how difficult the path seems. And as the sun set, Margaret knew, with all the certainty in her heart, that her future was just beginning. The journey of rediscovery never ends. It is a continuous path of learning and overcoming. Life, after all, is not a destination, but a journey, and she was ready to live every chapter with the strength of someone who knows that, in the end, the only thing that truly matters is our ability to write our own story.